Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's my pleasure to now call upon Mr. Richard Baldwin, Director of Investment Research, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, for his presentation on ASEAN Investment Report 2020-2021, Investing in Industry 4.0. Mr. Baldwin, welcome.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, foreign direct investment in the first half of 2021 in ASEAN was up 43%. My name is Richard Baldwin. I'm the Director of Investment Research at UNCTAD, and it's a pleasure to present to you the findings of the ASEAN Investment Report 2021, which we produce at UNCTAD together with the ASEAN Secretariat already since 2012 annually, with the financial support of the government of Australia. We've already presented the main findings of the report, policy findings to the report, to the economic ministers meeting in September, and I will give you a helicopter view of some of the main findings of the rest of the report. Let me share with you a few slides to do so. The report every year has a first chapter that provides data on foreign direct investment trends and corporate investment trends. It provides an overview of the policy measures taken over the year in ASEAN. And it has a second part of the report, the second half, which addresses a theme chapter. And as announced, the theme chapter this year is Industry 4.0 transformation. Of course, an extremely important topic for ASEAN for the future as a manufacturing powerhouse. Let's look at the trends first. In 2020, FDI flows in the ASEAN region dropped by 25% as a result, of course, of the pandemic. In the rest of the world, FDI flows fell by 35%. Obviously, the share of ASEAN in global investment flows increased from less than 12% in the record year for investment in ASEAN to date. So less than 12% in 2019 to almost 14% last year. Manufacturing fell the most. FDI in manufacturing fell by 55%. So manufacturing really suffered, and that's quite important for what we'll be talking about in terms of Industry 4.0 investment. The part of FDI in the ASEAN region last year that was most resilient was the intra-ASEAN investment flows. So intra-regional investment was relatively resilient. It went from about 12% in 2019 to 17% of total inflows in the ASEAN region in 2020. So that's a good sign for regional integration. It means really that the part of the investment flows in the region that is strongest and most resilient is the part that is really intra-regional, between countries of the region. Now, I mentioned already that in the first half of this year, we're seeing an upward trend of 43%. So that's really making up, rebounding, basically, making up for the fall in last year. And so if the trend continues, we're set to exceed the record level of investment flows in ASEAN in 2019 this year. Now, we have to make a few provisos with that. A big part of that is driven by the stimulus. It is driven by infrastructure investment. The value of international project finance projects and infrastructure announced in the first half of this year more than doubled. But greenfield investment in industry, greenfield investment projects in manufacturing announced in the first half of this year are still on a downward trend, minus 20%. So the prospects for manufacturing investment is really not in a recovery phase yet. It still needs support, and this is quite important. We have worldwide a similar trend in the stimulus packages being adopted around the world are all focused on infrastructure, digital infrastructure, green energy, and those are excellent targets for support. but industry investment is still weak around the world. So investment in global supply chains, in global value chains, in manufacturing is still very, very weak. And we need to make sure that we balance that more closely. Now, looking at the prospects for investment in ASEAN are quite positive, solid, and there's of course still factors of uncertainty, not least of which is the course, of course, that the pandemic will take. There are other factors of uncertainty, but ASEAN has, of course, very strong fundamentals. I mentioned the stimulus packages that have been adopted. There is a big need for investment in infrastructure. Some 360 billion of infrastructure packages in the region have already been adopted by governments, according to the IMF. So that will boost investment. The ASEAN region is also a policy exception. It is one of the few regions in the world where all policy measures being taken for investment are in the direction of a more conducive investment climate. And we see around the world policy measures being taken in the direction of more regulation, more restrictions, screening of inward investment. We monitor in UNCTAD investment policy measures for the G20 on twice a year. And over the last year, we have not found a single measure in the direction of more regulation or restriction in ASEAN. It is really aiming at continuing to create a more conducive climate for foreign direct investment. Of course, the regional integration efforts are also an important factor, and not least the signing, of course, of RCEP last year. And let's look at that a little bit more in detail. We looked in the ASEAN investment report at the opportunities that will flow from the signing of the RCEP agreement. You see here that RCEP already accounts for more than 40% of inward investment in the ASEAN region. But if we look at the total share of the RCEP region in total outflows around the world, it's almost 50%. And if we look at other regions that are advanced in regional integration, like in the EU, the shares of intra-regional investment easily exceed 60%. So there's certainly room for growth, and that's an important factor with RCEP and ASEAN inward investment that we see boosting investment over the coming years. Now let's look at the theme chapter a little bit. Industry 4.0, the relationship between foreign direct investment and Industry 4.0 is really a symbiotic relationship. The FDI can really support Industry 4.0 transformation, but advancing in Industry 4.0 ecosystems also helps attract FDI in manufacturing, which, as I mentioned earlier, is sorely needed. Now, what are the types of FDI one would attract to build or to support Industry 4.0 transformation? Well, one is, of course, the enabling factors, which is mostly telecoms infrastructure, the building of 5G, which is attracting a lot of investment in the ASEAN region, the attracting of investment in data centers, and all that is proceeding rapidly in the region. And the growth of data centers is such that in 2024, there's a chance that ASEAN might exceed the United States in terms of the attraction of new data center capacity. Another factor is, of course, attracting FDI in industries and of multinationals that are relatively advanced in adopting Industry 4.0 technologies. That boosts the presence of Industry 4.0 technologies and solutions in the local industry infrastructure, and of course also with local firms connecting to those multinational enterprises. A third area is attracting FDI in the production of Industry 4.0 technology and solutions, manufacturing of equipment, parts and components that in which the ASEAN region might become a competitive actor over the coming decade. So that's the third element. And the last one is, of course, working with multinational enterprises, foreign direct investors, through public-private partnerships, for example, to jointly upgrade skills or invest in skills development centers, centers of excellence, R&D centers, and the like. We always work with ASEAN governments, ministries of all 10 member states to develop the policy recommendations from the report. Clearly, what came out from the work with our colleagues was that the context for developing Industry 4.0 investment promotion policies is extremely important. Context being cyber law, cybersecurity, data residency, privacy, and digital frameworks. So the work going on e-commerce and data flows is extremely important as context. But of course, our first focus in the ASEAN Investment Report is on strategic investment policy and what type of FDI to attract, to build the enablers, to facilitate the adoption, to enhance the productive capacity in Industry 4.0. That's really important. And then there's, of course, a whole series of challenges that individual governments face. They are, of course, different for different countries at different levels of technological development, with different digital infrastructure in place, different levels of institutions, skills, and human resources. So the type of bottlenecks that need to be addressed is a really important factor in policy development. Let me conclude with the key recommendations that came out of the work with each of the governments of ASEAN and that are included in the ASEAN Investment Report this year. They are at the level of strategic investment policy, at the level of building the industrial infrastructure and ecosystem, and at the level of regional programs to collaborate. Let me synthesize. In strategic investment policy direction, as I mentioned, what is happening around the world in investment promotion agencies, investment authorities, they are building their plans to target investment in the areas of the symbiosis I mentioned earlier that they need. So the first element is really targeting investment in enablers, Industry 4.0 technology and solution segments, but to do so on the basis of existing industrial capacities and competitive advantages, for example, in the electronics and automotive sectors. But very importantly, and here I think the key word is complementarity, there is also adjacent sectors in which FDI promotion can really support the transformation to Industry 4.0. And that is, for example, one such as green energy, to continue the fast growth in attracting data centers that I talked about earlier. It is really important, for example, to have a presence of cheap green energy, because that is increasingly a locational determinant for investment in data centers. The second area, industrial infrastructure and ecosystem, and here the key word is probably clusters. Selectively invest and upgrade, for example, in the infrastructure, industrial parks, science parks, to support Industry 4.0 development. I would say that it's not just clusters that is a key word, it is also cost consciousness. It needs to be, we can't develop all of our free zones, all special economic zones into science parks. That would be too much. We need to really look at those parks that already have a strong cluster of industries that would have a high propensity to adopt relevant technologies and solutions. So focused investment concentrated on those areas where we have a good chance of building a competitive sector. And clusters, in large part, consist also of SMEs. So SME participation and supplier linkages with multinationals is really important in those parks. Final element, regional programs and coordination within the region to jointly work on Industry 4.0 development. We had an important meeting on Industry 4.0 investment during the World Investment Forum in UNCTAD last week. We had the presence of ASEAN colleagues, and the key thing that came out is this cannot be done alone. One needs to collaborate. So joint regular meetings of investment and digital bodies is an idea that was brought forward. Joint promotion, the establishment of an Industry 4.0 resource centers or forums for SMEs is an important suggestion to promote the Industry 4.0 transition. And of course, a final item is informed policymaking. At the moment, the Industry 4.0 Readiness Index being used around the region includes very different measures. It is very hard to know where different countries stand on Industry 4.0 development. That synthesizes the results of our report. It is available on both the UNCTAD websites and the ASEAN Secretariat websites. Again, a final thank you to both for the collaboration with the ASEAN Secretariat and to our friends at the Government of Australia for supporting the ASEAN Investment Report. Thank you very much.
Mr. Baldwin, thank you very much for joining us. Again, full details can be found of all those slides on the UNCTAD website. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall be back after this short message from BSP with our next panel discussion on the future of ASEAN.